Today on the Take On Board podcast, I'm speaking with Suzie Thoraval about governance of risk and audit. Before we start the podcast today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. For me, I am on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also pay my respects to any First Nations people who may be listening or watching today. I acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters, skies, culture, and country. I support Voice, Treaty and Truth for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, and I encourage others in the Take On Board community to do the same. Now, let me tell you about Suzie. Suzie is the independent chair of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee at the Victorian Collaborative Centre for Mental Health and Wellbeing, and she's a member of the Finance, Risk and Audit Committees at the Judicial College of Victoria and the cities of Greater Dandenong, Knox and Whittlesea. She's previously been on the advisory board for the College of Law's Centre for Legal Innovation and the chair of the Dyslexic Foundation and on the school council of Camberwell Primary School. Suzie is a seasoned legal, governance and strategic leadership professional with deep expertise in audit, risk and corporate governance. Perfect for us today. And she brings 25 years experience, including 13 years in senior leadership in government. She brings a Master's of Laws and a strategic, inquisitive mindset to every conversation. Welcome to the Take On Board podcast, Suzie.
Thanks so much for having me, Helia.
It is fabulous to have you here, and I'm so looking forward to digging into your risk and audit expertise. However, as always, before we go there, can you tell me what was young Suzie like, and when did you get your first inkling that you might end up in this strategic decision making or risk and audit type roles?
Oh, well, so young Suzie was somebody who was really focused in school, loved debating and all things humanities. From about year 9, wanted to be a lawyer, very, very clear direction, and pretty bloody minded about achieving it. And I suppose leadership roles felt natural to me. So I was school captain and pretty ambitious, I would say. I had a feminist mother who taught me I could do anything. And of course, when you get into life, the reality of you can do anything, but sometimes not all at once came up. But young Suzie was pretty ambitious and wanting to really make a difference as well, and speak for those who maybe didn't have the means or the ability to speak for themselves.
Yeah, right. Okay. I'm interested in your feminist mother as well, Suzie, and what how that played out for you as a young, ambitious woman as well. How did that, how did that play out?
Well, I suppose it served me very well in terms of not being afraid to speak up in class, both at school and during university. And then got into a very conservative large law firm, and it's fairly male dominated, top heavy kind of place. There were some great women to sort of look up to and aspire to be. But the more I went on in that environment, the more and the more I was sort of getting older and thinking about having a family and that kind of thing, the more I understood that it's hard to do everything well. And if you're going to be an active parent, you really need to make some compromises, unfortunately. So there were some years where I worked part-time and I still had a focus on my career. I never sort of let it go entirely, and I still was actively engaged. But, I suppose those very ambitious leadership goals had to sort of be in a bit of not a holding pattern, but a pause, just not elevating while my kids were little, I suppose. But I guess my interest in board roles and committee roles was born of that time when I thought, well, you can make a difference and have that leadership that's not necessarily all consuming. So that's what sparked my interest, I
Oh,
suppose.
well, that's a beautiful segue, isn't it? Let's use that as the segue. Let's dive on in then. You've you're on loads of risk and audit committees. You've got loads of experience in this space. Where should we start this conversation about the governance of risk and audit?
I think that it's really easy for boards to get and management to get caught up in the day to day of delivering and operational and just sort of trying to meet their objectives. But the need to step back and sort of zoom out and look at things. From a strategic perspective is really important. And that includes, what's my North Star? What are we trying to achieve? What are our values? This particular decision, how does that align with our ultimate vision? It absolutely includes the consideration, what are we trying to achieve and what might stop us from achieving that? And let's think about that for a few minutes and see if we've got the right things in place to stop bad stuff from, stopping us achieving our goals.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm thinking you're on the risk and audit committee of a number of organizations, and it's interesting when you talk about the North Star, the strategy. Often the board or with councils, the council is involved in setting the strategy. It's interesting for you then as the independent member of those risk and audit committees. How does that connection happen to that strategy? How does the North Star show up for you when you're an independent member rather than part of setting that full strategy overall?
Yeah, it's really important, I think, when you're not immersed in it all, to make sure that you're cognizant of what the vision is and the strategic pillars. That you're getting management in to talk about how that's playing out in practice. I think that's really important, and I suppose in a lot of my committees, I've fostered that trust with the board that they actually invite me into their planning days, and to give that perspective of the governance and risk, and it sort of helps me advise them better if I'm part of their planning. So where I'm invited into those planning days, that's one of the key things, and if not, then I'm absolutely asking questions that help me understand where whatever they're putting in front of the committee relates to their strategic goals.
Yeah, it's a great prompter, I think, then for boards, for board members who are listening to this, that may also have independent members of committees, involving them in that North Star process, whatever that might look like, incredibly valuable because if you want everybody to be following the North Star, then everybody needs to know what the North Star is. And
Absolutely, and I really try and make sure my agendas do tell the other members, have side conversations with the other members of so the board might have told me something, but the other independent members don't necessarily have
yes,
that context. So for them to have the context is really
yes,
important.
absolutely. Okay. So I'm wondering if there's any stories that you can share from your experience in risk and audit that might highlight some of the things that you see as important for people.
People sometimes can see risk management as a compliance exercise. And in government, certainly in the Victorian government, there are, standing directions under the Minister for Finance, under the Financial Management Act. They're sort of the baseline things you must do, and making sure that you're not just treating it like a compliance exercise, you're actually using it as an enabler and to add value to decision making is really important. So one of the ways that manifests can be in defining your risk appetite, for example. And I know, again, government boards actually now have to define their risk appetite, but I think there's varying levels of I don't know. I don't want to say quality, but ways in which the board and management actually use that risk appetite. Um, so once upon a time, before it was a compliance requirement, I was leading risk inside a prominent government department, and it was clear that defining your risk appetite was a good thing to do. really difficult in an environment where management is just trying to serve the government of the day, and what's on the front page of the Herald Sun is kind of what occupies them. And so it was a very reactive place. And so I suppose that goes to my stepping back point, which is, I found a way to have them articulate what their appetite for risk was, in a way that made sense to them, and to that we could communicate to the staff. And it actually shifted culture, because before that the staff were very much, it was don't stuff up and don't make decisions that kind of lead to a mistake. There was that culture of, so they were saying they would like innovation, but there was a feeling amongst the staff that they couldn't stuff up. So with innovation, you need to be able to fail and learn from it and move on and iterate. So that risk appetite, that set of statements that we articulated, really gave staff that freedom within boundaries to make decisions. And like, for example, one of the statements was around, put up those big ideas because we recognise some of them might fail. It was like giving permission for failure in a way that hadn't been articulated. So it really affected the culture. And I'm happy to say, I looked it up the other day, it's actually still in their risk appetite today. So that's a long time. And I guess that's a demonstration of the importance of a board setting risk appetite. And looking at it every year, because it does change when your context changes. So it's a living thing, and that's risk generally is a living thing. It can't be just done once and put in the bottom drawer. And so, yeah, now I really am inside committees asking about risk appetite and asking about when the board's going to set it, and trying to make sure that that's done in an active way, and that it's communicated to the staff in a way that allows them to say, I can make this decision so that I know what the board would think about this thing. So, it saves bottlenecks. It puts decision making in the hands of people who are actually at the front lines.
Yeah, amazing. I'm such a fan of the risk appetite conversation for the exact reasons that you've articulated it. It's sometimes it's like, oh, low risk, low risk, low risk. And obviously, you know, you don't want to be out needlessly taking risk, but no risk is a risk in and of itself. So
I
having the
agree.
board articulate that and be able to give permission, safe to fail and so on is a great thing. So I'm interested in that last part that you mentioned too, though, about, well, two parts on risk appetite. You've talked about it's not once and done. So I'm wondering what your views are, what your experience is around how regularly the risk appetite should be reviewed. And secondly, I'm interested in your experience around that communication of the risk appetite and what's worked well there. What can you share there?
Yeah. Certainly not once and done. The wisdom, the sort of established wisdom, is do it once a year at least. And I think if you've had that strategy conversation and you've set this year's strategy, then the risk appetite is the next kind of, that goes hand in hand, based on the strategy and that context setting. But I would say uncertainty is only increasing in our world, and more, things like a 5-year strategy, it's still worth doing because you've got that North Star, something to head towards. But you're really having to review whether those things that you've said you'll do still make sense much more frequently than you used to. And I think risk appetite is the same, because from quarter to quarter it can actually change. Now, I'm not proposing that boards revisit risk appetite every quarter, but certainly, on the agenda, if their context shifts, maybe making notes, or minuting, or just um, putting a placeholder in the fact that next time you're thinking about risk appetite, these things might have to shift. Um, yeah, so I think it's an active conversation, that should happen
Yes.
several times a year, in my view, to see whether it's actually. And also, you can set your risk appetite, and then when you see the decisions coming back as a board or a committee, you're like, actually, we didn't quite articulate that right, or people aren't sort of taking it in the way that we intended. And I suppose that goes to the communication. I think I have seen it where boards will set their risk appetite, but it doesn't necessarily flow down to every member of the staff. Um, in a sort of obvious way. So when I set that risk appetite way back then, the example I gave, I had it all graphicked up and in an eye-catching way, in a really easy to read, and a statement per risk category that sort of said, in relation to finance, we have an appetite, a low appetite for, not sticking to budgets. In relation to innovation, we have, and whatever. So really plain, easy ways to articulate, because I think people sometimes find risk management a bit inaccessible. But it's really about, what are you worried about, and what's keeping you up at night, and what are you doing about that, so that you can achieve your goals. It's really that simple. So the risk appetite communication needs to be really plain and help people in their day to day. So yeah, I put it up in front of every photocopier. These days people work from home and you're not in the photocopy rooms quite so much. But when you're there with the photocopying, the poster of the risk appetite was in front of you, so you could read it. And I had bookmarks, and thinking about people could put it on their desk, and when they're writing that policy proposal, they could look and go, what is the risk appetite around that? And I think as much as you can do to cascade that down, so that everybody knows what the risk appetite is, the better and more consistent decisions that you'll get throughout the organisation.
Oh, I love it. I'm imagining now, because you're right, the printer in the office, is still there, but people don't see it every day, and sometimes not even every week. So I'm now imagining people having, their virtual backgrounds that everybody has of these beautiful
Oh,
scenes.
that's
Yeah.
love that.
I'm imagining
Love that.
have the risk appetite. It depends on how many words are in it, I guess, but it also then
Yeah,
would ensure that it's not, war and peace, but is enough that is understandable. Anyway, that's what I'm
that's it. It's
imagining
got
in
to
this
be.
new world that we live in.
Yeah, that's right. Eye-catching and accessible is really important.
Yeah. And then you mentioned in there something about, keeping it live for people and really, yeah, keeping it live. And I wonder about the balance between what the Risk and Audit Committee does around the risk appetite statement versus what the board does about the risk appetite statement. Sometimes it does feel like, rightly, the deeper conversations are had at the Risk and Audit Committee, and then the board almost, I was going to say rubber stamps. That is too cursory. That's not entirely what I mean, but it is more, it's delved into at Risk and Audit, and the board is like, yeah, that looks good to us. Yet everybody, as you say, it needs to be every day for everybody in the organisation and the board. What's your advice, or what have you seen in your experience that really keeps it live at that level, not just with the staff, but also with the board?
Yeah. I've seen, Helia, where actually management have put drafted something for the board to rubber stamp it. I personally believe it should really start from the board. It should be a facilitated conversation, because it's not easy if you're not expert in it to come up with it. But it really needs, like, if you're going to do it in the best way possible, it really needs to come from the board, and somebody working with them to really articulate what is the board's risk appetite,
Yes.
and therefore the audit and risk committee are receiving that information, from the board. I don't believe that the audit and risk committee should drive that and then put it to the board. Although, if you're keeping an eye on emerging risks, and you're keeping an eye on, how management are, how well controlled those risks are, what are they doing about, trying to make them not happen, then I think, then the committee does have a role to say, well, we're seeing a range of, say, weak controls, or we're seeing management, decisions that are out of appetite. Board, we suggest perhaps you need to revisit that appetite and decide, do we need to actually move the needle on our risk appetite, um, or is it about right, and therefore we need to better communicate to management about how they need to be following that freedom within boundaries to make decisions that are aligned. So I do think it needs to be driven by the board, and if you're seeing rubber stamping, that to me is a little bit concerning, because although it's a committee of the board, the Risk and Audit Committee, but it is of the board, so you're there to serve the board, and the board is the sort of starting point for how you're going to manage risk, I think.
It's interesting, even on that. I know one board that I was on a while ago, we actually, every year looking at terms of reference, and we took risk appetite, the setting of risk appetite, off the committee, and it just was the board responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a really lovely way of surfacing that, so that it's like, no, it's not the committee's job. It is actually the board as a whole job. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. It's a strategic act to set your risk appetite.
Absolutely.
So it
Absolutely.
belongs at the board, I think. But obviously the committee is there to kind of play that out and help management with that freedom within boundaries. And then also the internal auditor, make sure that they're cognizant of it
Yes.
in what they're looking at.
Actually, I'm interested then. It could be a little bit chicken and egg, but, in setting the strategy and setting the North Star, do you do your risk appetite and then your strategy, or your strategy and then your risk appetite? Or do you do it doesn't matter where you start, you just circle back and make sure it's all aligned afterwards? What have you seen work well?
Yeah, in my ideal world, you're starting with strategy. Everything has to start there. And then you're saying what my appetite for risk are. And also we have to remember risk management is not just about kind of stopping bad stuff from happening. It's also what more risk do we need to be taking so that we can seize opportunities. Um, and therefore, whatever your strategy is, maybe you're growing, maybe you're trying new products, entering new markets, all of that are risks that you need to take, which will relate to the appetite for risk. So, yeah, I think you have to start with strategy
So true.
first.
It's so you must have seen it as well. I've definitely seen, yeah, we want innovation and we want newness and we want all of this stuff. Yet, everything that is brought to the board, no, look, no, that might not work. Oh, no, no, no. And it's just like, well, hang on. That misalignment is all around risk appetite. And
Absolutely. And you might have like you often see, we have a low appetite for people to be harmed in our organisation. And of course, that makes total sense. But if you had a zero appetite for that, you would put all your resources into wrapping each staff member in cotton wool and making sure that they didn't even get a paper cut. Well, that's not practical, especially in a resource constrained environment. So we need to be realistic about our appetite for risk, even in relation to people. And I know particularly in a government environment, that's hard to articulate, that acknowledgement that actually, and you think about a hospital setting or a police setting or somewhere where people in their jobs may be in harmful situations.
absolutely,
You have to be realistic about that, I think, to really make meaning
absolutely.
from that.
And, you talked about health services in terms of, potential harm to staff, but there's also, I think, balancing up not just health organisations, but those organisations that work in research. I mean, if you're in research, you're always doing new stuff. You're not necessarily
Yeah,
doing tried and true. You
that's
are
right.
doing new things, and new things takes risk. So it's, as you say, it's articulating that in a way that um, is open to the best outcomes for everybody through research. But yeah, it is a fine line to articulate that, and I think does require a really strong conversation between board and management.
Agreed. And the other thing I see, if I may help, Halia, a lot is, you'll see a risk, a portrait of risk where we are today, what our risks are. Maybe it's on a heat map or something. And there are certain risks, like I think sometimes people think, oh, we've always got to kind of lower them. But there are certain risks, like let's say cyber security breaches. It's a kind of if not,
Yeah.
yeah, when not if
Yeah.
situation.
Exactly.
So it's potentially catastrophic if it occurs. So it's always kind of going to sit in that red area of the risk matrix. But what I look for as an audit and risk committee member is how well controlled are the risks. Like, what am I doing about it? Am I doing everything that there is to do about cyber risk? All the patches and all the latest things. And that's what I'm really looking for. Not, oh, that risk's in the red and we've got to get it lower, because you need to be realistic about that, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Again, all key to risk appetite as well. Oh, Susie, I know we have just scratched the surface of some of your wisdom around risk and audit and your experience around risk and audit. But I'm wondering from the conversation today, what are the main points you want people to take away from what we've discussed today?
I suppose, just the importance of regularly stepping back, and, just looking at your strategy, and thinking, does it still make sense for the context in which we find ourselves? Because that uncertainty is just more and more, more uncertain things happen more often. And, what you thought your strategy was about might have to adjust. And the same with risk, that it's actually there to help you make decisions. So it needs to be an active process of thinking about where, the best use of my limited resources and time is to be put. And if you keep that, what am I trying to achieve and what might stop me from achieving it, mantra in your mind, and then how much appetite do I have for taking risk or not taking risk. I think that that's really important. And the committee is there to serve the board, but those conversations also, they need to happen at a board level as well. And your risk and audit people can, independence can really help you. So don't be afraid to invite them into a board conversation about risk to support your conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's such a good tip. Love it. Okay. And is there a resource you would like to share with the Take On Board community?
I suppose the resources that I thought of are around, and being comfortable with uncertainty, which I know we haven't. I mean, I've mentioned it a few times, but Jennifer Garvey Berger, she's got lots of wisdom around, just how to lead in uncertainty and complexity, that I think is, really important for boards and committees these days. So Unleash Your Complexity Genius is one of her books. I also like Michael Watkins' book, The Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, and there's a YouTube clip if you want a short version of it. Futurist Jermaine Cascio, we don't have time to go into it, but he's got this Barney framework, which is that the world is more brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible than ever. And he's got a framework for how to deal with that chaotic world. And I think that all goes to, setting strategy in that context, and making sure that you're, thinking about risks and having the foresight to put things in place, but also comfortable with there are certain uncertainties that are kind of unknowable, and just to kind of stay steady and comfortable with that.
Amazing. I love that. I'll be looking that up. Brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. Hopefully, that is not people's board papers, but it is the world that we live in. So
That's
that's a
right.
great set of resources. And folks, we will make sure we put a link in the show notes to all of those. Oh, Susie, thank you. Like I say, I know we've only just scratched the surface of some of your wisdom around risk and audit. I'm sure it's prompted some excellent thinking for people who are listening to today. So, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with the Take On Board community today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Helia. It's been a great pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for having me on.